The galaxy after the Sith conflict resolves would be fundamentally changed. Decades of being ruled by competing Sith lords would leave deep scars. Trust in government would be destroyed. The Force would be viewed with fear and suspicion by many. Entire generations would have grown up knowing nothing but war and oppression. Rebuilding would take centuries, not years. The new republic that emerges would need to address not just the political and economic damage, but the psychological and spiritual damage of living under Sith rule. The question of whether Force users should be allowed to hold political power would be debated intensely. Many would argue that the Sith's ability to manipulate minds and wield supernatural power made them impossible to oppose through normal democratic means. They might call for laws restricting Force users from government positions, or requiring them to register and be monitored. Luke and Leia would have to navigate these calls carefully, understanding the fear behind them while also recognizing that fear-based policies often lead to injustice. Plagueis' research and discoveries would pose ethical questions for whoever inherits his work. If he succeeded in understanding midi-chlorian manipulation and life creation, should that knowledge be preserved or destroyed? The scientific value is enormous, potentially allowing for cures to diseases, extended lifespans, and better understanding of the Force. But the potential for abuse is equally enormous. Who decides what to do with knowledge that could save billions or enslave them? This would be one of the most important decisions the post-Empire galaxy would have to make. The survivors of the Imperial era would have complicated feelings about the time of two Sith Lords. Some might remember it as the worst period of oppression, when the dark side was at its strongest. Others might remember the stability and prosperity, at least in certain sectors. Still others might recall how the conflict between Plagueis and Palpatine actually created opportunities for resistance that wouldn't have existed under a unified regime. History would struggle to judge this period fairly, especially since much of what happened at the highest levels would remain secret. The Jedi texts and holocrons that survived would be studied intensely for any information about dealing with Sith who can't be killed. The ancient Jedi faced similar problems with Sith who used dark side alchemy to extend their lives or resurrect themselves. Those old techniques for sealing, binding, or containing unkillable dark side users might become relevant again. Luke might need to become an expert in Force techniques that the modern Jedi Order had forgotten, reaching back to the Old Republic for knowledge on how to deal with threats like Plagueis. The Force itself would have been strained by decades of two powerful Sith Lords, both using it for their own purposes. Some planets might become dark side nexuses from proximity to their conflicts. Other places might become unusually strong in the light side as a counterbalance. The Force would be out of balance in ways that would take generations to heal. Force-sensitive children born during this time might be unusually powerful or unusually troubled, marked by the turbulence in the Force itself. The mythology and stories that emerge from this era would shape galactic culture for millennia. Tales of the two Dark Lords would be told alongside the stories of Luke Skywalker and the Rebellion. Future Force users would study this period to understand what happens when the dark side grows too strong and what it takes to overcome it. The lessons learned would influence everything from political philosophy to religious thought to military strategy. This would be remembered as the time when the galaxy came closest to eternal darkness and somehow survived. If either Plagueis or Palpatine achieved true immortality, the implications extend far beyond the original trilogy timeline. An immortal Sith Lord would be an eternal threat, impossible to permanently defeat. The galaxy might enter a cycle of constant vigilance, with each generation producing new heroes to fight against the same ancient enemy. Or the immortal Sith might eventually grow tired of conflict, having experienced everything power can offer and finding it hollow. This would be the ultimate test of the Sith philosophy. Does power really bring satisfaction, or does it just create an endless hunger that can never be filled? The relationship between master and apprentice in Sith tradition would be examined and possibly reformed if both Plagueis and Palpatine survive long-term. They might conclude that the rule of two creates unnecessary conflict and weakens the Sith. Or they might double down on it, arguing that their struggle makes each of them stronger. Their choice would define what the Sith become going forward. A Sith order that abandons the rule of two might become more stable, but also more vulnerable to the same infighting that destroyed the ancient Sith Empire. A Sith order that maintains it might remain strong, but would always be limited to two members locked in eternal conflict. The very concept of what it means to be Sith would evolve. Plagueis represents the intellectual, scientific approach to the dark side. Palpatine represents the political, manipulative approach. Their coexistence forces a question. Is there one right way to be Sith, or can the dark side be channeled in multiple valid ways? This philosophical question would matter to any dark side users who come after them, shaping how future Sith or dark side organizations develop their practices and beliefs. Let's explore deeper into how the day-to-day operations of the Empire would function under this divided leadership. Every Imperial department would effectively need to maintain two separate reporting chains. The Imperial Navy would have admirals loyal to Palpatine and others loyal to Plagueis. Fleet deployments would become political chess moves, with each Sith Lord trying to position their forces advantageously. A battle against the rebellion might be won, or lost not based on military strategy but on which Sith Lord's admiral was in command and whether they received support from the other's forces. The Moffs and regional governors would exploit this division ruthlessly. Someone like Governor Price on Lothal or Moff Gideon in the Outer Rim would play both Sith Lords against each other for personal gain. They'd promise loyalty to whoever offered more power or resources, then break that loyalty the moment a better deal appeared. This would create a culture of corruption and backstabbing throughout the Imperial hierarchy that would make the Empire less efficient, but also more unpredictable and dangerous. An incompetent official might survive for years by claiming protection from one Sith Lord whenever the other tried to remove them. The Rebel Alliance would need to develop entirely new intelligence analysis frameworks. Their spies would report conflicting information because different parts of the Empire would be operating under different priorities. One week the Empire might be prioritizing hunting down Jedi survivors, because that's Palpatine's focus. The next week resources shift to securing ancient Sith sites because Plagueis wants to find specific artifacts. The rebellion would struggle to predict Imperial actions because those actions weren't following a single coherent strategy. This chaos would be both an advantage, creating opportunities, and a disadvantage, making long-term planning nearly impossible. Mon Mothma's leadership of the rebellion would be tested in ways that go beyond military strategy. She'd need to understand Sith psychology and Force mysticism, topics she has no personal experience with. She'd rely heavily on any surviving Jedi or Force-sensitive advisors to help her understand the implications of having two Sith Lords. Her natural inclination toward diplomacy and negotiation would be challenged by the reality that you can't negotiate with beings who see compassion as weakness and agreements as tools to be broken the moment they're inconvenient. The Bothan spies who discover information about the second Death Star in the original timeline would face even greater challenges here. They'd need to determine not just where the Death Star is being built and when it will be operational, but which Sith Lord truly controls it. If they bring the Rebel fleet to attack and it turns out to be a trap set by the Sith Lord they didn't account for, the entire rebellion could be destroyed. The many Bothans who died to bring the information would be dying in even greater numbers because the intelligence requirements would be exponentially more complex. Admiral Akbar's famous tactical sense would need to account for the possibility of Imperial forces that don't coordinate with each other or might even sabotage each other. He might plan an attack on an Imperial facility only to discover that it's undermanned because the garrison was pulled away by one Sith Lord and not replaced because the other Sith Lord didn't know or didn't care. Or he might walk into a trap because two separate Imperial forces unknowingly created overlapping ambush plans. Naval warfare becomes less about predicting what a unified enemy will do and more about exploiting the chaos of a divided one. Wedge Antilles and the other Rogue Squadron pilots would face unique dangers. Space combat is already chaotic, but imagine fighting Imperial forces that might break off from battle without warning because they receive contradictory orders. Or Imperial pilots who fight with extra ferocity because they're trying to prove their loyalty to one Sith Lord by ignoring the other's command to retreat. The lack of unified Imperial command would make some battles easier for the rebellion, but others far more unpredictable and deadly. The everyday lives of ordinary Imperial citizens would reflect this divided leadership in subtle ways. Propaganda posters might emphasize different virtues depending on which Sith Lord commissioned them. Educational curricula might teach slightly different versions of Imperial history. Tax policies might vary not just by region, but by which Imperial administrator collected them and which Sith Lord they answered to. Most citizens wouldn't understand why these inconsistencies existed. but they'd create a pervasive sense of confusion and instability that would undermine faith in the Empire itself. Coruscant, as the Imperial capital, would be a pressure cooker of tension. The Imperial Palace would effectively be divided into two courts, with officials, military officers, and petitioners trying to figure out which Sith Lord to approach for any given issue. Physical space within the palace might even be contested, with certain wings or chambers being understood as belonging to one Sith Lord's sphere of influence. Visitors would need guides who understood the complex protocol of navigating between two supreme authorities who both claimed absolute power. The lower levels of Coruscant, already a haven for criminals and outcasts, would become even more lawless. With Imperial security forces divided in their loyalties and priorities, enforcement would be inconsistent. One day there might be a major crackdown on smuggling because Palpatine wants to demonstrate control. The next week, smugglers operate openly because Plagueis pulled security forces for his own purposes. Criminal organizations would learn to read the signs and adjust their operations to exploit the gaps in Imperial authority. The role of the Imperial Senate, already reduced to a powerless rubber stamp in the original timeline, would be even more complicated. Senators might be courted by both Sith Lords as potential allies or sources of information about the other. Some senators might try to play both sides, supporting whichever Sith Lord's agenda benefited their homeworlds. Others might genuinely try to serve the Empire and find themselves paralyzed by conflicting directives. The Senate's eventual dissolution by Palpatine in the original timeline might happen sooner, later, or not at all, depending on whether both Sith Lords see advantage in maintaining even the pretense of democracy. Bail Organa's double life as a senator and secret rebel supporter would be even more dangerous and complex. He'd need to maintain good relations with Imperial authorities while secretly undermining them, but now there are two sets of Imperial authorities to deceive. He might find opportunities in their division, using conflicts between Plagueis' agents and Palpatine's to cover rebel activities. Or he might find himself caught between them, with each Sith Lord watching him for signs that he's working with the other. His eventual fate and whether he survives to see Leia grow up might depend on navigating this treacherous political landscape. Breha Organa, Bail's wife and Leia's adoptive mother, would play a crucial role in this scenario. As Queen of Alderaan, she'd have her own political power and connections. She might act as a backup or alternative contact for the rebellion if Bail becomes too exposed. Her perspective as a leader who cares deeply about her people would inform how Alderaan responds to an empire divided against itself. She might argue for Alderaan maintaining strict neutrality in the Sith conflict while secretly supporting the rebellion, a dangerous balancing act that would require constant vigilance. Leia's upbringing on Alderaan would be shaped by growing up in this environment. She'd learn from Bail and Breha how to navigate complex political situations where power is divided and loyalties are unclear. She'd see firsthand how competing authorities can be played against each other and how important it is to maintain moral principles when everyone around you is compromising theirs. This education would prepare her perfectly for eventual leadership of the rebellion and later the New Republic. She'd be uniquely suited to understanding and exploiting the divisions within the Empire because she grew up watching masters of that art. Leia's Force sensitivity would develop differently as well. In the original timeline, she doesn't really explore her Force abilities until much later in life, but in a galaxy where the Force is so actively and visibly being used by two competing Sith Lords, she might become aware of her abilities earlier. Bail and Breha might even seek out quiet Force training for her, understanding that she'll need every advantage to survive in the dangerous galaxy they're bringing her into. She might not become a Jedi, but she could develop her Force sense enough to detect deception and danger, abilities that would serve her well in both politics and warfare. Luke's childhood on Tatooine would be deliberately isolated from these galactic events, but even there he'd feel the effects. Owen and Beru Lars would be more paranoid and protective, knowing that there are now two sets of Imperial agents potentially looking for Force-sensitive children. They might move farms more frequently or keep Luke from going into settlements as often. Luke's frustration with his constrained life would be even greater, and his desire to leave and have adventures would be fueled partly by not understanding why his guardians are so fearful. When he finally learns the truth, the revelation that they were protecting him from two Sith Lords rather than one would make their sacrifice even more meaningful. Obi-Wan's watchfulness over Luke would require even more careful balance. He'd need to stay alert for threats from two directions while also avoiding drawing attention from either. His periodic checks on Luke and interventions in his life would need to be even more subtle. The moment when Obi-Wan decides to reveal himself and begin Luke's training might come earlier if threats multiply, or later if he judges that Luke needs more maturity to handle the complexity of the situation. Either way, the training itself would emphasize different lessons, particularly about exploiting enemy divisions and understanding that evil can fight itself. The Tusken Raiders and Jawas of Tatooine would be affected in surprising ways. Imperial presence on backwater worlds like Tatooine might increase as both Sith Lords deploy more resources to search for threats and artifacts. This increased pressure might force the native species into more conflict with settlers, or it might force them into hiding in deeper desert regions. The social dynamics of Tatooine would shift, potentially making life even harder for moisture farmers like the Lars family. The isolation they sought might become harder to maintain as the Empire's reach extends further. The Hutts would be playing their own complex game with the Empire. Jabba in particular would maintain relationships with both Sith Lords' representatives, playing them against each other for maximum advantage. He might provide information about one to the other for the right price, or use his knowledge of their conflict to negotiate better terms for Hutt operations. The criminal empire he controls would actually grow stronger during this period because both Sith Lords would occasionally need the services that only the Hutts can provide, and neither could afford to completely alienate such a useful resource while competing with the other. The bounty hunters who work for the Empire would find themselves in high demand, but also in dangerous situations. Hunters like Boba Fett, Bossk, and IG-88 might receive competing contracts from agents of different Sith Lords. They'd need to carefully evaluate which jobs to take, knowing that completing a contract for one Sith Lord might make them a target for the other. The most successful hunters would be those who could maintain a reputation for professionalism and neutrality, completing jobs for both sides without appearing to favor either. Boba Fett's reputation for being the best would be built partly on his ability to navigate these dangerous political waters. The hunt for Han Solo, after he dumps Jabba's cargo, would intersect with larger Imperial concerns in new ways. Both Sith Lords might take an interest in Han for different reasons, maybe seeing him as connected to the rebellion or useful as leverage. The price on his head might fluctuate based on which Sith Lord's agents are currently prioritizing him. This would make Han's life as a smuggler even more complicated. He'd have to avoid not just Jabba's hunters, but also multiple Imperial factions that might want him for different reasons. His decision to join the rebellion might come partly from realizing that he's not safe anywhere else. Chewbacca's perspective as a Wookiee who survived the Clone Wars would be valuable. He'd remember the Republic and the early Empire's formation. He'd have seen political upheaval before and would understand better than most humans how quickly power can shift and how dangerous divided leadership is. His loyalty to Han would be tested by trying to keep his reckless friend alive in a galaxy that's more dangerous than Han fully appreciates. His life debt would extend to trying to teach Han when to run and when to fight, lessons that become increasingly important as they get drawn into the rebellion. The relationship between Han and Leia would develop under different circumstances. They'd still have their combative chemistry, but Leia might be more obviously competent in political manipulation and strategy, skills she needed to develop earlier and more fully in this timeline. Han might be more paranoid and suspicious, having learned that trusting the wrong people can get you killed when there are two Sith Lords watching everything. Their eventual romance would be built on recognizing in each other the ability to survive and even thrive in an impossible situation. They'd be partners who understand what the other has endured in ways that others can't. C-3PO and R2-D2's journey through this alternate timeline would give them unique perspectives. R2 in particular, having served Padme and witnessed the fall of the Republic, would carry memories of a time before the Sith conflict dominated everything. His recordings and secret files might contain information about both Plagueis and Palpatine from earlier periods. If anyone thought to properly search his memory banks, they might find crucial intelligence. But his loyalty to the Skywalker family and the rebellion would mean he'd only reveal this information when he judged it would help rather than harm. C-3PO's programming for protocol and etiquette would be constantly overwhelmed by trying to navigate Imperial protocols that differ based on which Sith Lord's representatives he's dealing with. The moment when Luke receives Leia's message through R2 and meets Obi-Wan would be weighted with even more significance. Obi-Wan's explanation of Anakin's fall would need to include the context of two Sith Lords and how Anakin was caught between them. Luke's black and white view of good and evil would be challenged earlier when he learns that the Empire he hates is also divided against itself. This might make him more sophisticated in his understanding of conflict, or it might confuse him until he gains more experience. Either way, his journey from farm boy to Jedi would be more complex. The destruction of Alderaan would potentially unfold differently. In the original timeline, Tarkin orders it destroyed to demonstrate the Death Star's power and to break Leia. With Plagueis alive and potentially controlling or influencing different parts of the Empire, would he allow such a demonstration? Alderaan is a wealthy, influential world whose destruction would send shockwaves through the galaxy. Plagueis might see this as wasteful, destroying valuable resources and creating unnecessary chaos. Or he might encourage it if it serves his purposes in his conflict with Palpatine. The political calculus behind such an atrocity would be even more cold and calculated with two Sith Lords involved in the decision. If Alderaan is destroyed, Leia's grief and rage would be compounded by needing to know which Sith Lord was truly responsible. Her quest for justice and revenge would be complicated by not having a single clear target. She might even find herself in the terrible position of needing to work with one Sith Lord against the other to achieve her goals, knowing that she's making deals with evil but seeing no other path forward. This moral compromise would haunt her but also make her a more nuanced and realistic leader who understands that perfect choices rarely exist in wartime. The assault on the Death Star would require different planning. The rebellion would need to account for the possibility of competing Imperial responses. Maybe Palpatine wants the Death Star protected at all costs, while Plagueis sees its destruction as an acceptable loss if it weakens Palpatine's position. The famous trench run might succeed partly because Imperial defenders receive contradictory orders, or because some Imperial forces are deliberately holding back. Luke's shot that destroys the Death Star would be miraculous as always, guided by the Force, but the context around it would reveal the cracks in Imperial unity that made such a miracle possible. The period between the destruction of the Death Star and the Battle of Hoth would see the rebellion struggling to capitalize on their victory while the Empire reels from internal recriminations. Palpatine and Plagueis would blame each other for the Death Star's destruction. This would intensify their conflict and might actually make the Empire more dangerous in some ways, as both Sith Lords lash out trying to prove their competence and power. The rebellion might win some battles simply because Imperial forces are more focused on internal politics than on fighting the external enemy, but they'd also face periods of extreme danger when one or both Sith Lords remember that destroying the rebellion would enhance their position relative to the other. The discovery of the rebel base on Hoth would happen through different intelligence channels. Maybe one Sith Lord's agents find it and decide not to share the information with the other, wanting to claim credit for destroying the rebellion alone. This could lead to a situation where the rebellion faces attack from one Imperial faction, while being unaware that another faction also knows their location. The Battle of Hoth might involve more Imperial forces than in the original timeline, or fewer if resources are divided. But either way, the dynamics would be different, and the rebellion's escape even more desperate. Luke's journey to Dagobah to train with Yoda would be motivated by even greater urgency. He'd know, either through Obi-Wan's ghost or through other means, that he's not facing one Sith Lord, but two. The training Yoda provides would emphasize different aspects of Jedi philosophy. Yoda might teach Luke specifically about exploiting conflicts between dark-side users, about patience and waiting for enemies to weaken each other, and about the dangers of thinking that just because dark-side users fight each other, they're not both still evil. The cave on Dagobah where Luke faces his fears might show him visions, not just of becoming like Vader, but of being caught between multiple dark powers, with no clear escape. Luke's vision in the cave of his friends' suffering would be more complex. He'd see them threatened not by a unified empire, but by competing Imperial factions, in danger from multiple directions simultaneously. His decision to leave his training early to save them would be even more reckless, because the situation is more complicated than he understands. Yoda and Obi-Wan's warnings would emphasize not just that he's not ready to face Vader, but that he's not ready to navigate the political end. Strategic complexity of a galaxy with two Sith Lords who might both see him as a threat or a tool. The confrontation between Luke and Vader on Cloud City would carry additional weight. Vader's revelation that he's Luke's father would be followed by a more complex offer. Instead of just join me and we'll rule the galaxy as father and son, Vader might explain the situation with Plagueis and Palpatine. He might position himself as trapped between two monsters and see Luke as a potential ally who could tip the balance, allowing Vader to destroy both Sith Lords and truly rule. This would be a more sophisticated temptation than just offering power. It would appeal to Luke's heroism by framing Vader as another victim who needs Luke's help to escape. Luke's refusal and his leap into the abyss would represent rejecting not just the dark side, but the entire framework of power politics that the Sith represent. He'd be saying that he'd rather die than participate in their games, even if it means potentially saving his father. This would be a powerful statement about the difference between Jedi and Sith philosophies. The Sith believe that power justifies any compromise and any alliance. Luke's choice represents believing in principles even when they seem suicidal, trusting that the Force and righteousness will provide a path forward even when none is visible. Han's encasement in carbonite and delivery to Jabba would happen as in the original timeline, but the reverberations would be different. Leia, Lando, Chewbacca, and the droids would spend the time between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi planning Han's rescue, but they'd also be trying to understand the larger strategic situation. They'd be gathering intelligence about the second Death Star, yes, but also about the relationship between Plagueis and Palpatine. They'd know that any plan to defeat the Empire needs to account for both Sith Lords, not just one. The rescue of Han from Jabba's palace would proceed roughly as in the original film, but Luke would be more clearly powerful and confident. His time between Empire and Return of the Jedi wouldn't just be spent constructing his lightsaber and completing his Jedi training. He'd be studying what Obi-Wan and Yoda could tell him about Sith, about power struggles, about how to be a Jedi in a galaxy where the dark side is so dominant it's fighting with itself. He'd return to his friends as someone who understands the true scope of what they face and is ready to do whatever it takes. The Battle of Endor would be a completely different scenario with Plagueis alive. The throne room scene that's so central to Return of the Jedi would potentially have 3 Sith instead of 2. Imagine Luke being brought before not just Palpatine, but both Sith Lords. They might try to outdo each other in tempting him, each offering their own vision of what Luke could become. Or they might present a united front, recognizing that turning Luke is more important than their personal rivalry. Either approach would test Luke in different ways. If Plagueis is present during Luke's confrontation with Palpatine and Vader, the dynamics become incredibly complex. Luke would be trying to redeem his father while also resisting 2 different Sith Lords. Vader would be watching his master and his former master compete for his son while also feeling his own pull toward the light side. Palpatine and Plagueis would each be trying to use the situation to weaken or destroy the other. The room would be filled with competing agendas and allegiances that could shift at any moment. One wrong word or action could tip everything into violence or create an unexpected alliance. The moment when Vader ultimately redeems himself by saving Luke from Palpatine would be even more powerful if he's also defying Plagueis. He'd be rejecting both of his Sith masters, both of the dark powers that have controlled his life, in favor of saving his son. This would be a complete break with everything Vader has been for decades. It would also be tactically more difficult because he'd potentially be facing Force lightning or other attacks from 2 sources. His sacrifice might need to be even greater, requiring him to use all his remaining strength to protect Luke from both Sith Lords long enough for Luke to escape or for the light side to triumph. Alternatively, Vader might see an opportunity in the conflict between the 2 Sith Lords. He might encourage them to fight each other, stepping back and protecting Luke while his 2 masters destroy themselves. This would be a more calculating approach, using Sith nature against itself. Vader would be betting that Plagueis and Palpatine's hatred for each other exceeds their hatred for the Jedi, that they can't resist the chance to eliminate their rival even if it means letting their potential prize escape. This would show Vader using the wisdom gained from decades under Sith rule to finally break free. The destruction of the second Death Star and the death of one or both Sith Lords would spark celebrations across the galaxy, but also uncertainty. With the Emperor dead but Plagueis alive, or vice versa, is the Empire truly defeated? If both Sith Lords die, are there other dark side users waiting to seize power? The rebellion's victory would need to be followed immediately by consolidation and by hunting down any remaining Imperial leadership before new tyrannies can emerge. The New Republic would be born in an atmosphere of justified paranoia, knowing that the Sith proved capable of hiding and manipulating for generations. The final scenes of Return of the Jedi would be bittersweet in different ways. Luke would have defeated not one but two Sith Lords, an achievement beyond what any Jedi in recent history accomplished. But the cost would be even higher, and the uncertainty about the future even greater. When Luke sees the Force ghosts of Anakin, Yoda, and Obi-Wan, they might be joined by other Jedi who fell fighting the Sith. The celebration would be real, but tempered by knowledge of how close they came to losing everything and how much work remains to heal the galaxy. The sequel era, if we extend our speculation that far, would be fundamentally different. Instead of worrying about the remnants of Palpatine's empire and his potential return, the New Republic would be dealing with the legacy of two competing Sith philosophies. There might be separate dark side cults that follow Plagueis' scientific approach versus Palpatine's political approach. The First Order might not exist, or might exist in a different form, perhaps as a fusion of different Imperial factions that were divided under the two Sith Lords and now try to unite under a common banner. Kylo Ren's fall to the dark side, if it happens at all in this timeline, would be influenced by different factors. Instead of Snoke whispering in his mind, he might be contacted by remnants of Plagueis' followers or Palpatine's loyalists. His struggle with identity and legacy would be different, because Darth Vader's story would be known differently. Vader wouldn't just be the dark enforcer who redeemed himself, but the apprentice who was caught between two masters and ultimately rejected both. That's a more complex legacy to inherit and might push Ben Solo in different directions. Rey's journey, if she exists in this timeline, would involve discovering different truths about the Force and the Sith. Instead of being Palpatine's granddaughter, if we accept Rise of Skywalker's revelation, she might be connected to Plagueis' experiments with creating life. She could literally be an artificial being created through midi-chlorian manipulation, Plagueis' ultimate achievement in his quest to control life and death. Her struggle would be about proving that she's more than someone's experiment, that artificial origins don't determine destiny, and that she can choose light despite being literally created by darkness. The philosophical questions raised by this scenario would resonate through generations. Can two absolute evils coexist, or will they always destroy each other? Is it better to have one unified enemy or competing evils that might cancel each other out? What does it mean to be Sith if the rule of two is violated? Can immortality ever be worth the cost of what you become in achieving it? These questions don't have simple answers, and that's precisely what makes them worth exploring. They force us to think deeply about power, morality, and the nature of conflict itself. In the end, the scenario of Plagueis surviving changes Star Wars in fundamental ways. It's not just about having two villains instead of one. It's about exploring what happens when the dark side is represented by two different philosophies and approaches, when master and apprentice become rivals instead of succession, when the rule of two breaks down and creates chaos instead of order. It's about testing whether Luke's compassion and the light side's principles can overcome not just evil, but eternal, scientifically enhanced, and politically sophisticated evil. It's about asking whether the cycle of conflict between light and dark can ever truly end, or if balance means accepting that the struggle will continue forever, with different champions on each side, taking up the fight generation after generation. The galaxy would be darker, more complex and more dangerous with Plagueis alive. But it would also force characters to grow in ways they wouldn't otherwise. Luke would need to become wiser and more strategic, understanding that being powerful in the Force isn't enough when facing enemies who have spent lifetimes perfecting their craft. Leia would need to become a more skilled political operator, learning to navigate not just galactic politics but the competing interests of two supreme powers who both claim ultimate authority. Vader would need to become more independent and capable of choosing his own path, rather than simply following whoever seems strongest. The rebellion would need to become more sophisticated in exploiting enemy divisions while not losing their moral clarity about what they're fighting for, and perhaps that's the most important lesson from this scenario. Challenges force growth. Easy victories teach nothing. The heroes of Star Wars are defined by the obstacles they overcome and the principles they maintain despite overwhelming temptation to compromise. Giving them a harder challenge, an enemy that's twice as dangerous and infinitely more complicated, would forge them into even greater heroes. They'd make mistakes, suffer losses, and face moral dilemmas with no good answers. But they'd also discover reserves of strength, wisdom, and compassion they didn't know they possessed. That's what makes this what-if scenario so compelling. It's not about making things grimdark or hopeless. It's about raising the stakes high enough that overcoming them means something profound, something that resonates beyond just the story and speaks to fundamental truths about human nature, power, and the eternal struggle between selfishness and selflessness. The story of Plagueis surviving isn't just an alternate timeline to entertain ourselves with. It's a meditation on power, loyalty, ambition, and what it means to truly win when victory seems impossible. It asks whether two evils fighting each other is better or worse than one unified evil, whether the chaos of division serves the cause of good or simply creates different forms of suffering. It explores whether knowledge and science can be evil in themselves, or if evil lies only in how they're used, whether seeking to understand life and death is noble or blasphemous. It questions whether immortality is a blessing that should be pursued, or a curse that traps its possessor in an eternal cycle of hunger and emptiness. These are questions without easy answers, and that's exactly why they're worth exploring. Why they challenge us to think more deeply about what we believe and why we believe it. So what if Darth Plagueis survived Palpatine's betrayal? The galaxy would burn brighter and darker simultaneously, the contrast between light and shadow becoming more stark rather than less. Heroes would rise higher and villains would sink deeper, each driving the other toward their ultimate expression. The Force would be strained to its limits and potentially beyond, tested by two masters who each believe they can bend it entirely to their will. And in the end, the question wouldn't be whether good triumphs over evil, because that's too simple, too binary, too divorced from the messy reality of moral choice. The question would be whether wisdom can overcome power, whether compassion can heal what hatred has broken, and whether hope can endure when darkness seems eternal and victory impossible. Those are the real tests, the ones that define not just Star Wars, but every story about the struggle between light and dark, every mythology about the battle between selflessness and selfishness. And in this scenario, the psychological warfare between Plagueis and Palpatine would extend into every corner of their conflict. Both are masters of manipulation, but their styles differ fundamentally. Palpatine manipulates through understanding what people want and offering it to them, creating dependency and obligation. Plagueis manipulates through understanding what people fear and threatening it, creating paranoia and desperation. Together they'd create an environment where no one feels safe, where every ally might be a spy and every victory might be a setup for future betrayal. This would be exhausting for everyone caught in their web, from the highest Imperial officers to the lowest stormtroopers. The stormtroopers themselves would experience this division in concrete ways. Training protocols might differ based on which Sith Lord's philosophy dominated their training facility. Some stormtroopers would be trained to follow orders without question, the traditional Imperial approach favored by Palpatine's emphasis on hierarchy and control. Others might be trained in more independent thinking and problem-solving, reflecting Plagueis' scientific approach that values intelligence and adaptability. When these differently trained units work together in the field, the clash of approaches would create both friction and unexpected tactical flexibility. Finn's eventual defection from the First Order, if we're considering how this timeline affects the sequel era, would be influenced by growing up in a military culture already fractured by competing philosophies. He might defect earlier or for different reasons, having seen firsthand how the Empire's division leads to suffering and waste. Or he might be more conflicted, having been trained to think more independently than stormtroopers in the original timeline, making his choice to leave more conscious and deliberate rather than reactive. The Emperor's hands, the secret agents Palpatine trains to serve him directly, would be more numerous and more active in this timeline. Palpatine would need eyes and ears throughout the Empire that he knows aren't compromised by Plagueis. These agents would be trained in Force techniques, combat, and infiltration. They'd operate in the shadows, sometimes working against official Imperial policy if that policy was influenced by Plagueis. The most famous of these, Mara Jade in the expanded universe, would have an even more complex role, potentially being aware of Plagueis' existence and tasked specifically with gathering intelligence about him. Plagueis would have his own network of agents, though organized differently. Where Palpatine's hands are loyal through a combination of training and force bonding, Plagueis' agents might be more like research assistants and lab subjects. He'd recruit scientists, doctors, and force-sensitive individuals willing to participate in his experiments in exchange for knowledge and power. These agents would be less personally loyal but bound to him through shared goals and the understanding that his research could grant them abilities they couldn't achieve otherwise. Some might be more monster than human by the time Plagueis is done with them, their bodies and minds altered by his experiments. The philosophical divide between these two networks would represent the fundamental difference between the Sith Lords. Palpatine believes power comes from domination and control of others. Plagueis believes power comes from understanding and control of the Force itself. Both are right in their own way, which makes their conflict so evenly matched. Palpatine has more political power and more loyal servants. Plagueis has deeper knowledge and potentially unbeatable personal power through his research. The question of which approach ultimately proves superior would drive much of their conflict. The Inquisitorius, the organization of dark-side users who hunt Jedi survivors, would be caught between these competing philosophies. Some Inquisitors would be loyal to Palpatine, viewing themselves as his personal hunters. Others might be swayed by Plagueis, seduced by promises of knowledge about the Force that goes beyond what the Inquisitorius normally teaches. The Grand Inquisitor himself would need to carefully balance his service to both Sith Lords, knowing that appearing to favor one could make him a target of the other. His eventual fate might depend on whether he manages this balance successfully or finally has to choose a side. The various Inquisitors we see in Rebels and other media would have more complex motivations in this timeline. The Second Sister's quest for revenge might intersect with the Sith conflict in unexpected ways. The Fifth Brother and Seventh Sister's hunting of Ahsoka Tano might be complicated by receiving conflicting orders. Some Inquisitors might even see the Sith conflict as an opportunity to break free from both masters, using the chaos to pursue their own agendas. This would make them more dangerous in some ways, but also more unpredictable and less effective as a unified force. Ahsoka Tano's survival of Order 66 and her role in the rebellion would be affected by facing an empire divided against itself. She'd be one of the few people with experience in both the Clone Wars and the Imperial era who understands the Force at a high level. Her perspective on the Sith conflict would be valuable to the rebellion. She might even deduce that there are two Sith Lords before anyone else, recognizing patterns in Imperial behavior that suggest competing authorities. Her encounters with Vader would be even more poignant if she understands that Anakin is caught between two masters rather than serving only one. Ezra Bridger's journey from street rat to Jedi would be influenced by growing up on Lothal in an empire that's divided against itself. The Imperial occupation of his homeworld might be harsher or more chaotic, depending on which Sith Lord's forces are currently in charge. His parents' rebel broadcasts might have focused on exposing not just Imperial tyranny, but the specific divisions within Imperial leadership. When Ezra begins training with Kanan Jarrus, part of that training would need to address how to fight enemies who are also fighting each other, a strategic consideration that traditional Jedi training never needed to emphasize. Kanan Jarrus himself, survivor of Order 66 and reluctant Jedi Master, would have additional trauma and knowledge to process. He survived the Purge, but did he encounter agents of both Sith Lords during his years in hiding? Did he learn to recognize the signs that distinguished Palpatine's hunters from Plagueis's? His teaching of Ezra would be informed by hard-won practical experience of surviving in a galaxy where the Sith aren't a unified threat, but a multi-headed Hydra. This would make his lessons more cynical in some ways, but also more realistic and potentially more useful. The Ghost crew as a whole would need to adapt their operations to account for Imperial divisions. Hera Syndulla's tactical planning would factor in the possibility that Imperial forces might not coordinate effectively. Sabine Wren's Imperial Academy training would have exposed her to the ideological divisions within the military, giving her insights into how to exploit them. Zeb Garazeb's perspective as a survivor of genocide would be complicated by knowing that the empire that destroyed his people was divided against itself. Does that make the crime worse? That they paused their internal conflict long enough to commit such an atrocity? Or does it create opportunities for justice and revenge? The Siege of Lothal and other major rebel story arcs would unfold differently with Plagueis alive. Tarkin's involvement would be colored by his need to prove his worth to both Sith Lords simultaneously. The decision to destroy Jedi Temple on Lothal or other significant targets would go through more complex approval chains. Some operations might be approved by one Sith Lord and sabotaged by the other. The rebels would learn to watch for these signs and time their operations accordingly, striking when Imperial forces are most divided and disorganized. The ancient Sith temple on Malachor that Ezra discovers would have additional significance. This place where ancient Sith killed ancient Jedi in massive numbers would attract the attention of both Plagueis and Palpatine. Both would want to plunder its knowledge and artifacts. The holocron Ezra finds there might contain information specifically about Sith conflicts, lessons from previous times when the rule of two broke down or when Sith fought each other. Maul's presence on Malachor and his attempts to manipulate Ezra would be complicated by Maul's knowledge of both Sith Lords and his own complex feelings about his former masters. Maul himself deserves special attention in this scenario. In the original timeline, he's cut in half by Obi-Wan, survives through hatred alone, goes mad, rebuilds himself, and spends years pursuing revenge against everyone who wronged him. With Plagueis alive, Maul would have another target for his hatred. He might blame Plagueis for his fate, arguing that if his master's master had controlled Palpatine better, Maul wouldn't have been sent to Naboo and wouldn't have been defeated. Or he might try to play Plagueis and Palpatine against each other, offering his services to one in exchange for help destroying the other. The criminal empire Maul builds in Clone Wars would be influenced by his awareness of the Sith conflict. He might try to position himself as a power broker, someone who can offer services to both Sith Lords while remaining independent of both. His takeover of Mandalore would be even more audacious if he's trying to create a power base that can resist both Sith Lords. When Palpatine eventually comes to Mandalore to deal with Maul personally, Plagueis' response would be telling. Would he let Palpatine handle his former apprentice, or would he? Bo-Katan cries, and the future of Mandalore would be affected by this larger context. The Mandalorian people have always valued strength and independence, making them natural resistors to Imperial rule. But an empire divided against itself might see Mandalore as either a threat that must be crushed or a potential ally that could tip the balance. Different Imperial factions might approach Mandalore with different offers or threats. The Mandalorian civil war between those who accept Imperial rule and those who resist would be even more complex if some Mandalorians align with Plagueis' faction, while others align with Palpatine's din. Jaren's journey in the Mandalorian series would take place in a post-Imperial galaxy that's dealing with the legacy of two Sith Lords rather than one. The Imperial remnants he encounters might be specifically followers of one Sith Lord trying to resurrect their master or continue their work. The Beskar steel he seeks might have been hoarded by different Imperial factions for different purposes. His protection of Grogu would take on additional significance if Grogu's Force sensitivity makes him valuable, not just as a generic Force-sensitive child, but as someone who might hold keys to understanding. The kind of life manipulation research Plagueis was conducting. Grogu himself, the child, raises fascinating questions in this timeline. He's the same species as Yoda and roughly 50 years old during The Mandalorian, meaning he was alive during the Clone Wars and the rise of the Empire. Did he encounter agents of either Sith Lord during his early life? Was he hidden away by Jedi who knew that two Sith Lords hunting for Force-sensitive children would be twice as dangerous? His slow aging means he might have memories or knowledge that span this entire era, if only he could communicate them clearly. The fact that he survived suggests either incredible luck or that someone very powerful was protecting him, possibly playing the two Sith Lords against each other to keep him safe. The role of the Mandalorian culture in preserving Beskar armor and weapons becomes more significant when considering an empire that's focused internally on Sith conflict. The Mandalorians might have had more freedom to operate during periods when Imperial attention was focused on the Sith power struggle. Or they might have been targeted even more aggressively by one Sith Lord, trying to eliminate potential threats before the other Sith Lord could recruit them. The Armorer's philosophy about the way of the Mandalore and the importance of protecting foundlings would be informed by decades of navigating these dangerous waters. Moff Gideon's possession of the Darksaber and his schemes involving Grogu would connect to the larger legacy of the Sith conflict. Was Gideon aligned with one of the two Sith Lords specifically, or did he try to remain independent? His experiments with midi-chlorians and cloning seem to follow Plagueis' research more than Palpatine's approach, suggesting he might have been influenced by or served under Plagueis specifically. If so, his goals might not just be personal power, but continuing research that he believes will unlock the secrets of life and death that Plagueis was pursuing. The cloning facilities on Exegol that play a role in Rise of Skywalker would have a different origin in this timeline. If Plagueis survived and continued his research for decades, the cloning technology we see used to resurrect Palpatine might actually have been developed by Plagueis for his own purposes. The grotesque clone bodies and the life transfer techniques might be his work. This would mean that even if Palpatine eventually defeats or outlasts Plagueis, he still relies on his master's research to achieve his own immortality. It would be the ultimate irony. Palpatine betrays Plagueis to escape his shadow, only to spend the rest of his existence literally dependent on knowledge only Plagueis possessed. The Final Order fleet and the Sith Eternal cultists on Exegol would have a more complex origin if there were two Sith Lords to follow. There might be separate cultist factions, some devoted to Plagueis' philosophy and others to Palpatine's. These factions might have cooperated, competed, or coexisted in uneasy tension. The rituals and practices they developed would reflect both Sith traditions, creating a syncretic dark side religion that draws on multiple sources. This would make them more powerful in some ways, but also potentially more fragmented and easier to defeat if their internal divisions can be exploited. The world between worlds and time. Travel elements that appear in Rebels take on new significance in this scenario. If either Sith Lord gained access to this realm, they could potentially undo their defeats or prevent their rival from ever rising to power. The fact that the world between worlds seems to resist being used for such purposes suggests the Force itself has safeguards against this kind of manipulation. But both Plagueis and Palpatine would certainly try to breach those safeguards. The keepers of the world between worlds, whatever they are, would need to be constantly vigilant against attempts by both Sith Lords to corrupt or control this space outside of time. The Mortis arc from Clone Wars, where Anakin encounters the embodiments of the light side, dark side, and balance, would be interpreted differently in this timeline. The Father's warnings about bringing balance to the Force would resonate more strongly if Anakin knows he's eventually going to serve under not one but two Sith Masters. The Son's temptations would be more sophisticated, potentially offering Anakin alliance against both Sith Lords rather than simply offering dark side power. The daughter's sacrifice would symbolize the light side's willingness to give everything for others, standing in stark contrast to the Sith philosophy of taking everything for oneself that both Plagueis and Palpatine embody. The ancient Sith Lords, whose knowledge both Plagueis and Palpatine seek, would have opinions about their inheritors. Darth Bane created the Rule of Two specifically to prevent the kind of internal conflict that destroyed the ancient Sith Empire. His spirit or his holocrons might have stern words for both Plagueis and Palpatine about violating his rule. Darth Revan, who walked both light and dark and understood balance better than almost any Force user, might see their conflict as proof that the Sith philosophy is fundamentally flawed. These ancient voices would add weight to the idea that what Plagueis and Palpatine are doing isn't just tactically unwise, but philosophically wrong according to Sith tradition itself. The journals and teachings of these ancient Sith would be sought by both current lords, each looking for an edge. Plagueis might find texts about Sith alchemy and biological manipulation from Dark Lords who performed similar experiments millennia ago. Palpatine might discover holocrons about Sith who ruled empires and the techniques they used to maintain power. Both would be disappointed to learn that most ancient Sith who achieved their level of power eventually fell to exactly the kind of internal conflict they're now engaged in. History repeating itself would be a theme, the tragedy of the Sith being that they're doomed to fight each other even when they know intellectually that such conflict weakens them. The role of the Jedi archives and the knowledge contained within them becomes even more critical. When the Jedi Temple falls and the archives are seized, both Sith Lords would want access to their contents. The archives contain information about previous Sith conflicts, strategies the Jedi used to exploit those conflicts, and techniques for resisting dark side corruption. Both Plagueis and Palpatine would study this information, but they'd also worry about the other learning something useful from it. The archives might be divided between them, with each Sith Lord claiming certain texts and neither having complete access. This would be yet another source of tension and competition. Jocasta Nu, the Jedi archivist who tries to save knowledge during the Purge, would have even more significant role if her actions prevent both Sith Lords from accessing certain crucial information. In Darth Vader comics, she has a list of Force-sensitive children and knowledge of a secret Jedi archive. If she successfully keeps this information from Imperial hands, she's keeping it from two Sith Lords instead of one, doubling the value of her sacrifice. The Jedi knowledge she preserves might be what eventually allows Luke to understand and defeat both Sith Lords, making her posthumous contribution to the rebellion's victory even more substantial. The Kyber crystals that power both lightsabers and the Death Star become strategic resources that both Sith Lords would want to control. The Empire's strip mining of Jedha and other Kyber-rich worlds would be driven partly by both Sith Lords wanting to deny the other access to this crucial resource. The spiritual significance of Kyber crystals, their connection to the Force and their need to be attuned to their user, would make them more than just strategic materials. They're symbolic of the Force itself, and the Empire's industrial exploitation of them represents the Sith philosophy of domination over nature rather than harmony with it. Chirrut Imwe and Baze Malbus, the guardian of the Wills and his protector from Rogue One, would have perspectives shaped by watching the Empire fight itself while destroying their holy city. Chirrut's faith in the Force and his belief that it guides everything would be tested by witnessing such concentrated evil and chaos. His famous line, "I am one with the Force and the Force is with me," would take on additional meaning as a declaration of faith despite overwhelming evidence that darkness is winning. Baze's loss of faith would be even more understandable when the Guardians he believed in couldn't protect against not one but two Sith Lords, working to destroy everything sacred. The theft of the Death Star plans that drives the plot of Rogue One would be complicated by needing to determine which Sith Lord truly controls the weapon. Jyn Erso and her team would be risking their lives to steal plans that might reveal not just technical specifications, but political control structures. The data they transmit to the rebel fleet might include information about the split within Imperial leadership, intelligence that proves as valuable as the technical plans themselves. Their sacrifice would enable not just the Death Star's eventual destruction, but a deeper understanding of the enemy the rebellion faces. Director Krennic's obsession with the Death Star and his competition with Tarkin would be amplified by the need to prove his worth to 2 Sith Lords instead of 1. His paranoia and ambition would drive him to take even greater risks, knowing that failure means not just losing his position, but potentially being killed by whichever Sith Lord decides he's no longer useful. His death at the hands of his own creation, killed by the weapon he spent years building, would be even more tragic if he was trying to serve 2 masters who both viewed him as merely a tool. Saw Gerrera's extremist rebel cell and his willingness to use tactics that the mainstream rebellion rejects would be influenced by his understanding of the enemy. If Saw knows there are 2 Sith Lords, he might argue that extreme measures are justified because the threat is twice as great. His torture of Bodhi Rook and his use of violence might be rationalized as necessary evils when facing enemies who control life and death itself. This doesn't make his methods right, but it adds context that makes his choices more understandable, even if still problematic. The moral questions about rebellion and resistance that run through Rogue One and other Star Wars stories become even more complex in this scenario. Is it acceptable to become like your enemy if that's what it takes to defeat them? If the Sith Lords use every dirty trick and show no mercy, can the rebellion afford to maintain moral high ground? These questions don't have easy answers, and different characters would answer them differently. The tension between idealists like Mon Mothma who want to win cleanly and pragmatists like Saw who think clean victories are impossible would define much of the rebellion's internal debates. The various rebel cells and their different approaches to fighting the Empire would be influenced by which aspects of the Sith conflict they're most exposed to. Cells operating in sectors controlled by Plagueis' forces might develop different tactics than those fighting Palpatine's agents. Some rebel leaders might even try to negotiate with one Sith Lord against the other, dangerous deals that could backfire catastrophically, but might also provide crucial advantages. The question of whether the ends justify the means would be asked constantly, with each answer carrying life or death consequences. In the final analysis, the survival of Darth Plagueis transformed Star Wars from a story about the struggle between light and dark into something more complex. A story about how even evil contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The Sith philosophy of power through passion and strength through victory contains no mechanism for cooperation or trust. When 2 beings who embody this philosophy completely are forced to coexist, conflict is inevitable. This doesn't mean they're less dangerous. In some ways, they're more dangerous because they're pushing each other to greater extremes. But it does mean they have a fundamental weakness that can be exploited by those wise enough to see it. The heroes who fight against this divided darkness would need to be careful not to become like their enemies. The temptation to use the Sith Lord's conflict against them could lead to moral compromises that erode what makes the rebellion worth fighting for. Maintaining principles while being strategically flexible, holding to ideals while acknowledging harsh realities, these would be the challenges that define heroism in this timeline. It's not enough to defeat evil. You have to defeat it in a way that doesn't make you evil in the process. That's the lesson Luke learns, that his father learns too late, and that the galaxy must remember if it's going to build something better from the ashes of the Empire. So yes, if Darth Plagueis survived, everything changes. But the core truth of Star Wars remains. Hope persists, compassion matters, and love is stronger than hate. Those truths would be tested more severely, questioned more deeply, and proven at greater cost. But they would endure, because they must endure, because without them there is no point to any of the struggle. The dark can fight itself forever, but light only needs one moment, one choice, one act of selfless love to break through and remind everyone what they're really fighting for. That's the real power in Star Wars, and no Sith Lord, no matter how knowledgeable or how immortal, can ultimately stand against it. The room is silent except for Palpatine's breathing. He stands over his master's body, savoring the moment. Darth Plagueis lies motionless on his bed, seemingly dead from the lightning Palpatine just unleashed. The apprentice has finally killed the master. The rule of two has been fulfilled. Palpatine turns to leave, already planning his next moves as the sole Sith Lord in the galaxy. Then Plagueis' eyes snap open. His hand shoots up, gripping Palpatine's throat with the Force. The shock on Palpatine's face is absolute. Because the one Sith who spent decades learning to manipulate life and death itself, the being who claimed he could keep people from dying, just proved he wasn't lying. Darth Plagueis the Wise has survived his own murder. This changes everything. Not just the relationship between master and apprentice, not just the Sith's grand plan, everything. The Clone Wars, the Empire, Darth Vader, the Rebellion, every single event you know from Star Wars is about to be rewritten. Because in the original timeline, Palpatine's betrayal worked. He became the sole Sith Master and manipulated the galaxy for decades without anyone to challenge his authority. But now? Now there are two Sith Masters and the rule of two says that's impossible. One of them has to die. The question is which one? And what does the galaxy look like when the dust settles? Imagine the sheer terror on Palpatine's face in this moment. He just used everything he had, every ounce of his power, every technique he learned, to kill the most dangerous being in the galaxy. And it didn't work. His master, the Sith Lord who conquered death itself, is staring at him with eyes full of dark satisfaction. Palpatine realizes in this instant that every plan he made, every scheme he crafted for his future as the sole Dark Lord, has just turned to ash. He's not free. He'll never be free. Not as long as Plagueis lives. And Plagueis might live forever. But here's where it gets even more twisted. Plagueis doesn't kill him. Not yet. Because Plagueis sees opportunity in this betrayal. His apprentice just proved he's powerful, ambitious, and ruthless enough to attempt deicide. Those are exactly the qualities the Sith value. So instead of ending Palpatine, Plagueis does something far more cruel. He lets him live. But from this moment forward, their relationship transforms into something the galaxy has never seen. Two Sith Masters, locked in an endless game of manipulation and murder, forced to work together while constantly plotting each other's destruction. This is where the real story begins. Because every major event in Star Wars that you know and love is about to spiral into chaos. Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side? Imagine him being pulled in two different directions by two competing Sith Lords. The Clone Wars? Picture a conflict where both sides are secretly controlled by Sith Masters who are also trying to destroy each other. Order 66 and the Jedi Purge. What happens when two Sith Lords both want to eliminate the Jedi but can't agree on how or when? The Empire itself? It's about to become a house divided, with every officer, every stormtrooper, every planet caught between two supreme powers who both claim absolute authority. Luke Skywalker won't just face one emperor in a throne room. He'll face a galaxy where darkness has been fighting itself for decades, where the Sith's greatest weakness, their inability to cooperate, has been exposed for all to see. But that doesn't make them weaker. It makes them unpredictable, desperate, more dangerous than ever before. Because a Sith Lord who knows his rival is planning his death becomes paranoid, aggressive, and willing to burn the entire galaxy if it means survival. And here's the ultimate question that will haunt this entire timeline. What if Plagueis really did master death? What if his survival isn't luck or preparation, but proof that he's achieved true immortality? Then Palpatine isn't just fighting his master. He's fighting an eternal enemy who has infinite time to plan revenge, who can't be killed no matter what, who will outlast every scheme and every betrayal. That's not just a political problem. That's an existential nightmare, and it changes everything about how power works in the Star Wars galaxy. Let's understand who these two beings really are, because this conflict isn't just about power. It's about two fundamentally different philosophies of what the dark side means and how it should be used. Plagueis was a moon, a member of a species known for their intelligence and their control of the banking clan. He operated in plain sight as Higo Damask, a legitimate businessman and financier who moved in the highest circles of galactic society. Nobody suspected that this respectable banker was actually a Dark Lord of the Sith. This dual identity gave him access and influence that most Sith could only dream of. He could manipulate economies, fund political campaigns, and engineer financial crises, all while appearing to be a pillar of civilized society. But Plagueis' true obsession wasn't money or political power. It was life itself. He spent decades researching the midi-chlorians, those microscopic organisms that connect living beings to the Force. Most Sith wanted power to dominate others. Plagueis wanted to dominate death itself. He conducted experiments that would horrify even other dark side users. He learned to manipulate midi-chlorians to create life, to extend life, and most importantly, to prevent death. The tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, as Palpatine would later tell Anakin, was that he could save others from death, but not himself. Except in our scenario, that's not true. He saved himself. Plagueis took Palpatine as his apprentice when the young man was still known as Sheev Palpatine, an ambitious nobleman from Naboo. Plagueis saw in Palpatine something he'd been searching for: pure ambition married to extraordinary force potential and political cunning. Palpatine was everything a Sith apprentice should be, which meant he was also the greatest threat to his master. The rule of two demands this tension. The apprentice must eventually try to kill the master. If they succeed, they've proven themselves worthy. If they fail, they weren't strong enough. It's natural selection applied to the Sith lineage. For years, Plagueis taught Palpatine everything about the dark side. They worked together on the grand plan to destroy the Jedi and take over the Republic. Plagueis handled the financial and economic manipulation while Palpatine focused on the political side. They were partners in the truest sense, but both knew it couldn't last. Palpatine watched his master's experiments with life and death with fascination and growing confidence. If Plagueis could prevent death, why hadn't he made himself truly immortal yet? Palpatine concluded that his master's research was incomplete, that for all his knowledge, Plagueis remained vulnerable. So Palpatine made his move on a night when his master was drunk and sleeping, unleashing his hatred in a torrent of Force lightning. But here's what Palpatine didn't know. Plagueis had been testing his theories on himself for years. His midi-chlorian manipulation wasn't just theoretical. He'd actually altered his own biology, creating fail-safes and redundancies that would activate if his life was threatened. When Palpatine's lightning coursed through him, these mechanisms triggered. His body appeared dead, his heart stopped, his breathing ceased. But on a cellular level, his midi-chlorians were working frantically to repair the damage and restart his systems. It took minutes, maybe an hour, long enough for Palpatine to believe he'd won, but not long enough for the body to grow cold. When Plagueis' hand closes around Palpatine's throat through the Force, the younger Sith's mind races through possibilities. Fight back? He's still recovering from the energy he expended in the attack. Flee? That would be admitting defeat and weakness. Beg for mercy? That's not the Sith way. Instead, Palpatine does something unexpected. He stops struggling and speaks. His words are carefully chosen, a mix of truth and manipulation that would define their relationship going forward. He tells Plagueis that he had to try, that the rule of two demanded it. He praises his master's power, calling his survival proof of his mastery over death. And he offers his continued service, arguing that together they can accomplish more than either could alone. Plagueis releases him, not out of forgiveness or sentiment, but out of calculation. Killing Palpatine now would leave him without an apprentice, without a political operative, and would waste years of training. More importantly, Palpatine has just proven something valuable. His attack nearly worked. If Plagueis' experiments hadn't succeeded, he would be dead. This means Palpatine is powerful, perhaps powerful enough to be useful, but it also means Plagueis can never trust him again. The master-apprentice relationship is forever changed. They're no longer teacher and student. They're rivals forced into an uneasy alliance. The immediate question is what happens next. In the original timeline, Palpatine spends the next years implementing their plan solo. He becomes Senator of Naboo, orchestrates the invasion of his homeworld, uses the crisis to become Chancellor, and starts the Clone Wars. All of this was already in motion before he killed Plagueis, but Palpatine executed it alone. Now Plagueis is alive to oversee and potentially interfere with every step. This creates a fascinating dynamic. They need each other, but they're also constantly maneuvering for dominance. Plagueis would insist on being more directly involved in the political side of their plan. He can't let Palpatine operate independently anymore. So when the Trade Federation blockades Naboo, Plagueis is watching closely, making sure Palpatine doesn't use the crisis to consolidate power beyond what they agreed. When Palpatine becomes Chancellor, Plagueis ensures he has his own agents in key positions, creating a shadow government within the government. Every move Palpatine makes is now subject to his master's scrutiny and potential veto. Palpatine would chafe under this renewed oversight. He tasted true independence, thought he'd achieved it, only to have it snatched away. He'd become more subtle in his maneuvering, more careful about hiding his true intentions. Every public action would have layers of hidden meaning. He'd be playing two games simultaneously: the public game of rising to power in the Republic, and the private game of trying to outmaneuver his master. This would actually make him more dangerous, not less. The constraints would force him to become even more cunning. The Clone Wars would still happen, but with significant differences. In the original timeline, Palpatine orchestrated the war as a way to gain emergency powers, eliminate the Jedi, and create his empire. With Plagueis alive, the question becomes, whose empire is it? Both Sith Lords want to rule the galaxy, but only one can be Emperor. This creates a secondary conflict running underneath the visible war. While the Republic fights the Separatists, the two Sith Masters are fighting each other through proxies and manipulation. Plagueis might support the Separatist movement more openly. As Higo Damask, he already controls much of the banking clan. He could position himself as a power broker, someone both sides need to finance their war efforts. This would give him leverage over Palpatine, who needs the war to continue, but also needs to appear to be fighting to end it. Imagine secret meetings where Plagueis threatens to cut off Separatist funding unless Palpatine agrees to certain terms. Or, conversely, threatens to flood the Separatists with so many resources that they actually win, ruining Palpatine's careful balance. Count Dooku's role becomes incredibly complicated. In the original timeline, Dooku is Palpatine's secret apprentice, leading the Separatists while actually working to further Sidious's plans. But if Plagueis is alive, who is Dooku really serving? Palpatine recruited him, but Plagueis might try to steal his loyalty or at least ensure Dooku reports to both of them. Dooku himself would be caught in the middle, trying to navigate the dangerous politics of serving two Sith Masters who are barely pretending to work together. One wrong move and either master might decide he's become a liability. The rule of two creates an impossible situation with three Sith in play. Technically, there should only be two: a master and an apprentice. With Plagueis and Palpatine both alive, they're both masters in their own right. Dooku's position as Palpatine's apprentice is undermined by Palpatine still technically being Plagueis' apprentice. The hierarchy becomes confused and unstable. Plagueis might insist that Palpatine give up Dooku, or that Dooku serve both of them, or he might try to take Dooku as his own apprentice. Each option creates new tensions and possibilities for betrayal. Then there's Darth Maul. In the original timeline, Palpatine trained Maul as his apprentice before taking Dooku, but Maul was never meant to. The Jedi would sense something is wrong, but they wouldn't understand what. In the original timeline, they sense the dark side clouding everything but can't pinpoint the source. With two Sith Lords actively working and competing against each other, the dark side would be even more turbulent and confusing. The Jedi might actually come closer to discovering the truth simply because there's twice as much Sith activity to detect. But they'd still struggle to believe that the Sith could be operating at the highest levels of government, let alone that there might be two of them. Qui-Gon Jinn's discovery of Anakin Skywalker takes on new significance. In the original timeline, Palpatine sees Anakin as the key to everything: a replacement for Dooku, a superweapon, and potentially the chosen one of prophecy. But if Plagueis is alive, he'd have his own interest in Anakin. Remember, Plagueis' experiments with midichlorians might have actually created Anakin. Some theories suggest that Plagueis' manipulation of the Force to create life is what caused the Force itself to create Anakin as a response, a chosen one to bring balance. If Plagueis believes this, he'd see Anakin as his creation, his legacy, and his rightful apprentice. This creates a competition for Anakin's future that goes beyond what we see in the films. Both Plagueis and Palpatine would be maneuvering to influence the boy. They can't be too obvious about it without alerting the Jedi, but they'd each try to position themselves as his ally and mentor. Imagine Plagueis, as Higo Damask, taking an interest in the Republic's hero, the young Jedi who won the Battle of Naboo. He might offer advice, funding for Padmé's political causes that Anakin cares about, or simply be a friendly face from outside the Jedi Order. Meanwhile, Palpatine is doing the same thing, leading to a situation where Anakin is being groomed by two different Sith Lords who are pretending to be his friends. Anakin's fall to the dark side would be accelerated by this attention. Both Sith Lords are master manipulators, and having both of them working on him, even while competing with each other, would overwhelm his defenses faster. His attachment to Padmé, his frustration with the Jedi Council, his fear of loss, all of these would be exploited by two different sources. But here's the twist. Each Sith Lord would try to turn Anakin against the other. Palpatine might warn Anakin about Plagueis, painting him as dangerous and unstable. Plagueis might warn Anakin about Palpatine, suggesting his political ambitions are leading the Republic toward tyranny. The vision that finally breaks Anakin, the dream of Padmé dying in childbirth, might be manufactured by one Sith Lord to force Anakin's hand. In the original timeline, it's unclear if the dream is a genuine Force vision or something Palpatine planted. With Plagueis alive, it could be either one of them, or both independently having the same idea. The promise of saving Padmé from death would resonate differently coming from Plagueis, who actually has expertise in preventing death, versus Palpatine, who only knows the legend of Plagueis' power. Anakin might be more inclined to trust Plagueis' offer because it's backed by actual results rather than just promises. The moment Anakin becomes Darth Vader is where things could go completely differently. In the original timeline, Palpatine renames him and immediately sends him to attack the Jedi Temple. But if Plagueis is present or aware of what's happening, he might intervene. He might try to claim Vader as his own apprentice, arguing that Palpatine has proven untrustworthy and that Vader needs a true master. This would force Vader to choose between them immediately, or potentially play them against each other. A Vader who knows there are two Sith Masters competing for his loyalty would be in a unique position of power, at least initially. Order 66 and the Jedi Purge would proceed. But the aftermath would be complicated by the power struggle. Palpatine wants to become Emperor and rule the galaxy, but Plagueis has been working toward the same goal for decades longer. When Palpatine declares the formation of the Galactic Empire, does Plagueis accept him as Emperor, or does he challenge him? If Plagueis objects, what can Palpatine do? He can't reveal that his main opponent is a Sith Lord without exposing himself. He'd have to find other ways to sideline or eliminate his former master. One possibility is that they agree to share power, at least publicly. Plagueis might become the Grand Vizier or head of the Imperial Council, a position of enormous authority that keeps him close to the throne. To the galaxy, they'd appear as allies, the wise advisor and the strong emperor. But privately, they'd be locked in constant struggle. Every policy decision, every military campaign, every appointment would be a battle. The Imperial Court would become a viper's nest as officials try to figure out which Sith Lord to truly serve. The construction of the Death Star would be a major point of contention. In the original timeline, the Death Star is Palpatine's ultimate weapon, a tool of fear to control the galaxy. But Plagueis might see it differently. He might view it as wasteful, a crude application of power when subtle manipulation would work better. Or he might want to control it himself, seeing it as too dangerous to leave in Palpatine's hands. The secret construction project would have two Sith Lords competing to place their own agents in key positions, each trying to ensure they can control or destroy the superweapon if necessary. Darth Vader's role in this empire would be fundamentally different. Instead of being Palpatine's enforcer and the clear second in command, he'd be caught between two masters. Both Plagueis and Palpatine would give him orders, sometimes contradictory ones. Vader would have to navigate this carefully. Disobeying either could be fatal, but trying to serve both might be impossible. This would add to his rage and frustration. He fell to the dark side expecting power, and instead finds himself trapped between two beings who see him as a tool rather than a true partner. Vader's search for Luke would also be complicated. When he discovers he has a son, does he tell Palpatine? Does he tell Plagueis? Does he tell both neither, or use the information as leverage in their conflict? In the original timeline, Vader proposes to Palpatine that they turn Luke and rule the galaxy together as father and son. With Plagueis in play, Vader might see Luke as a potential ally in the complex game he's trapped in. A powerful Force sensitive who isn't yet claimed by either Sith Master could tip the balance of power. Luke Skywalker's journey would be radically different. Instead of one clear enemy in the Emperor, he'd be facing a more complex situation. Plagueis might try to recruit him separately from Palpatine, offering him knowledge of the Force that even the Jedi didn't have. Plagueis could present himself as a teacher who understands both light and dark, someone who has transcended the simple binary that destroyed the old Jedi Order. This would be a more sophisticated temptation than Palpatine's crude offers of power. The rebellion would be fighting a stronger, more unified empire if Plagueis and Palpatine managed to keep their conflict mostly hidden. Or they might be fighting an empire tearing itself apart from internal struggle if the two Sith can't maintain even the appearance of cooperation. There might even be opportunities for the rebellion to exploit the split. If they discover there are two Sith lords in charge, and those lords are at odds, they might try to play them against each other. This would be incredibly dangerous, but it could also be the rebellion's best chance at victory. Mon Mothma and the other rebellion leaders would need to understand the situation they're really in. Intelligence gathered by Bothan spies might reveal the split between Plagueis and Palpatine. The rebellion's strategy would shift from simply opposing the Empire to potentially exploiting the civil war within it. But they'd have to be careful. Two Sith Lords at each other's throats are still two Sith Lords, either of whom could crush the rebellion if they stopped fighting each other long enough to focus on external threats. The dynamic between Plagueis and Palpatine would evolve over years. Initially, there might be a Cold War, both sides maneuvering but avoiding direct confrontation. But as the Empire stabilizes and external threats diminish, the question of who really rules would become impossible to ignore. The tension would build toward an inevitable final confrontation. The rule of two demands it. There can be only one Dark Lord of the Sith at a time as the Master. One of them has to die or submit, and neither Plagueis nor Palpatine is capable of submission. Plagueis' advantage is his knowledge and his mastery over life and death. He's already proven he can survive what should have killed him. He has decades more experience than Palpatine and deeper understanding of the Force's mysteries. His experiments with midi-chlorians might have given him abilities that Palpatine can't match. He could potentially drain Palpatine's life force, or manipulate the midi-chlorians in Palpatine's body to weaken him. These are powers beyond conventional dark side abilities, the fruits of his lifelong research. Palpatine's advantage is his political power and his ruthlessness. He's built the Empire with himself at its center. He controls the military, the bureaucracy, and has the loyalty of key figures like Vader. He's also proven himself willing to do absolutely anything to win. Where Plagueis might hesitate because of intellectual curiosity or scientific interest, Palpatine would strike without mercy. His understanding of power is more practical and direct. He knows that the being who sits on the throne makes the rules, regardless of who is theoretically more knowledgeable. The final confrontation between them would be one of the most significant duels in Star Wars history. It wouldn't be just a lightsaber fight, though there would certainly be that. It would be a battle of the Force at its highest level. Two Sith Masters with decades of experience and knowledge throwing everything they have at each other. The location would matter enormously. If it happens in the Imperial Palace on Coruscant, Palpatine has the home advantage. If it happens somewhere connected to Plagueis' research, perhaps a hidden laboratory where he conducted his darkest experiments, Plagueis would have the edge. Imagine the battle itself. Plagueis would use his knowledge of life manipulation to age Palpatine, to cause his cells to degenerate and die. Palpatine would respond with torrents of Force lightning so intense they warp the space around them. Plagueis might summon the very midi-chlorians in the environment to attack Palpatine at a cellular level. Palpatine might tap into dark side techniques so terrible that even Plagueis never explored them. Powers drawn from pure hate and malice rather than knowledge. The room around them would be destroyed, not from explosive power but from the fundamental nature of reality breaking down under the strain of their conflict. The outcome of this battle would depend on several factors. Has Plagueis truly achieved immortality, or is he just very hard to kill? If it's the latter, Palpatine could win through sheer persistence, attacking again and again until even Plagueis' formidable defenses fail. But if Plagueis has actually made himself unkillable, then Palpatine would need a different strategy. He might need to trap or contain his master rather than destroy him. Or he might need to do something that Plagueis wouldn't expect. Something that goes against Sith nature itself. One possibility is that Palpatine would seek out a power that neither he nor Plagueis has fully explored, the light side. Not to become good, but to understand it well enough to use it as a weapon. The light side is anathema to Sith, but Palpatine's pragmatism might override his ideology if it means survival. He might study Jedi techniques, learning how they would counter dark side immortality. This would be the ultimate irony. One Sith Lord using light side knowledge to kill another. Alternatively, Vader could be the deciding factor. If the battle between Plagueis and Palpatine reaches a stalemate, Vader's choice of which master to support could tip the balance. Both Sith Lords would try to convince him. Palpatine would appeal to their history together, the power they've shared, and the promise that with Plagueis gone, Vader would truly be his partner. Plagueis would offer knowledge, the secrets of preventing death that could potentially save Padme retroactively or bring her back, and freedom from Palpatine's manipulation. Vader's decision would reshape the galaxy's future. If Vader sides with Palpatine, they might manage to kill or imprison Plagueis through combined effort. This would leave the Empire more or less as we know it, but with Vader in a stronger position. He helped destroy a Sith Master, proving his worth and earning more respect and authority. Palpatine would owe him, at least theoretically, though Sith don't really honor debts. The dynamic between them would shift, potentially setting up a different version of their eventual confrontation. If Vader sides with Plagueis, the galaxy changes dramatically. Plagueis as Emperor would rule very differently than Palpatine. He's more intellectual, more interested in scientific advancement and understanding the Force than in crude demonstrations of power. His empire might actually be more stable and prosperous in some ways, though no less tyrannical. He'd pursue his research into immortality with the full resources of the Empire behind him, potentially achieving true immortality and ruling forever. The idea of an immortal Sith Emperor is terrifying beyond measure. If Vader refuses to choose and instead attacks both of them, trying to seize power for himself, that creates a three-way battle that could end with any outcome. Vader is powerful, but he's not as knowledgeable or skilled as either Plagueis or Palpatine. However, he might not need to defeat both of them. He might just need to let them weaken each other and then strike at the right moment. This would be very Sith-like, the apprentice waiting for the masters to destroy each other before claiming the throne. It would also parallel Palpatine's original betrayal of Plagueis, coming full circle. There's another possible outcome that's even more disturbing. Plagueis and Palpatine realize that neither can defeat the other and decide to genuinely share power. They'd abandon the rule of two, at least between themselves, and rule as co-emperors. This would make the Empire vastly more dangerous. Two Sith Masters working together instead of against each other could accomplish things that neither could alone. They'd combine Palpatine's political genius and ruthless efficiency with Plagueis' scientific knowledge and Force mastery. The rebellion would face an enemy that's essentially unbeatable. In this scenario, they might even decide to train multiple Sith apprentices, completely abandoning Bane's rule of two. They'd argue that the rule served its purpose, keeping the Sith hidden and focused while they were weak. But now that they rule the galaxy, why limit themselves? They could create a new Sith Order, dozens or hundreds of dark side users serving under them. This would be a return to the old Sith Empire's structure, but with modern resources and knowledge. The galaxy would enter a true dark age with no hope of the Sith destroying themselves through internal conflict. Luke and Leia's role in any of these scenarios would be crucial. They're the children of the Chosen One, powerful in the Force and potentially strong enough to challenge even Sith Masters. But they'd be facing longer odds than in the original timeline. In the films, Luke manages to redeem his father and exploit the conflict between Vader and Palpatine. With Plagueis alive, the situation is more complex. There might not be the same opportunity for redemption if Vader is juggling loyalty to two masters, or if one of those masters actually offers him something Palpatine never could: the power to bring Padme back. Leia's political role in the rebellion becomes even more important. If the Empire is divided between Plagueis and Palpatine, she might be able to exploit that division diplomatically as well as militarily. She could potentially negotiate with one against the other, play them off each other, or find ways to ensure their conflict never fully resolves. Her Force sensitivity, if trained, could also make her a player in the battle between Sith Lords. Two children of Anakin Skywalker working together might be the only force in the galaxy capable of standing against two Sith Masters. The prophecy of the Chosen One takes on new meaning in this context. Anakin was supposed to bring balance to the Force by destroying the Sith, but if Plagueis survives and continues to exist alongside Palpatine, did Anakin fail? Or is balance something more complex than just destroying all dark side users? Maybe balance requires both light and dark to exist in some form, and having two Sith Masters fighting each other actually creates more balance than having one dominant Sith Lord. The Force itself might view Plagueis' survival as part of its plan rather than a deviation from it. Plagueis' research into midi-chlorians and life creation would continue with even more resources if he survives long-term. He might succeed in creating artificial Force-sensitive beings, growing them in laboratories with predetermined abilities and loyalties. Imagine an army of Force users, not as powerful as natural-born Jedi or Sith, but numerous enough to overwhelm through sheer numbers. This would change the fundamental nature of the Force in the galaxy, making it less mysterious and more scientific. The implications are staggering and potentially galaxy-altering in ways beyond politics or war. The Force itself might react to Plagueis' experiments. The Force has will and agency to some degree, as evidenced by prophecies and the creation of Anakin. If Plagueis pushes too far in trying to control and manipulate life, the Force might push back. This could manifest as Force storms, as reality itself rejecting his creations, or as the Force empowering individuals to oppose him specifically. The Force might create another Chosen One, someone specifically designed to stop Plagueis' unnatural manipulation of life and death. The ancient Sith Lords would be relevant to consider. Plagueis and Palpatine both study the history of the Sith, learning from ancient holocrons and texts. If they're in conflict, both might seek out ancient Sith knowledge that could give them an edge. This could lead them to places like Moraband or Exegol, ancient Sith strongholds filled with dark side power and forgotten techniques. They might even try to resurrect or commune with ancient Sith spirits, asking for knowledge or power. This would be dangerous for both of them, as ancient Sith are not known for their helpfulness or restraint. The economics of the Empire would be interesting under Plagueis' influence. As someone who controlled the banking clan, he understands finance in ways Palpatine never did. An empire with Plagueis involved in economic policy might actually be more prosperous for citizens, at least in material terms. He'd ensure efficient resource allocation, smart investments in infrastructure and technology, and financial systems that keep the economy growing. This would make the empire more popular and harder to oppose, even as it remains politically and morally tyrannical. People might accept oppression if it comes with prosperity. The relationship between Plagueis and Palpatine might develop in unexpected directions over time. They've spent years working together, decades even. Despite their conflict and mutual distrust, there might be moments of genuine connection. They're the only beings in the galaxy who truly understand each other, the only ones operating at their level. They might develop a twisted respect or even affection, even as they plot each other's deaths. This would make their eventual confrontation even more tragic and bitter. They're not just enemies. They're former partners who know everything about each other. Palpatine might actually learn genuine humility from surviving Plagueis' survival. In the original timeline, he becomes increasingly arrogant and overconfident, convinced of his own invincibility. But knowing that his master survived his betrayal and could potentially kill him at any time would keep him cautious. This might actually make him a better ruler in some ways, more careful in his planning, and less likely to make the kinds of mistakes that eventually lead to his downfall. An emperor who doesn't underestimate his enemies is far more dangerous than one who believes himself invincible. Plagueis might become more ruthless from the experience of being betrayed. Before Palpatine's attack, he perhaps retained some element of scientific objectivity, viewing his dark side research with intellectual detachment. After surviving betrayal, he might embrace the Sith philosophy more fully, understanding that trust is weakness and that only power matters. This would make him darker and more dangerous, but also potentially more predictable. A Plagueis who fully embraces Sith nature might make mistakes that a more detached scientist wouldn't. The various Imperial forces and organizations would be affected by the split between the two Sith lords. The Imperial military might be divided between admirals and generals who answer to Palpatine versus those who answer to Plagueis. The Imperial Inquisitors hunting down surviving Jedi might receive conflicting orders. Imperial intelligence might be split into competing factions. This divided loyalty would weaken the Empire's effectiveness, but also create opportunities for ambitious individuals to play both sides and rise through the ranks faster. Characters like Grand Moff Tarkin would navigate this split carefully. Tarkin is ruthless and ambitious enough to recognize the advantage of being valuable to both Sith Lords without being loyal to either. He'd present himself as a pragmatic servant of the Empire itself, rather than of any individual, making himself useful to both while ensuring neither can afford to eliminate him. His management of the Death Star project would involve reporting to both masters while revealing his true progress to neither. Thrawn, if he rises to prominence in this timeline, would be fascinating to watch. His analytical mind would quickly recognize the split between Plagueis and Palpatine. He might even deduce that both are Sith Lords before anyone else in the military. How he'd use this knowledge is unpredictable. Would he exploit it, choose a side, or try to remain neutral? His loyalty is primarily to the Chiss ascendancy and his own understanding of order, not to the Empire itself. He might see the Sith conflict as an opportunity or a threat depending on how it affects his larger goals. The criminal underworld would absolutely thrive in an empire divided against itself. Organizations like Black Sun, the Hutt cartels, and the Pike Syndicate would find more opportunities for corruption and profit. Imperial officials competing for favor with different Sith Lords would be more easily bribed or manipulated. Smugglers like Han Solo would find it easier to operate because Imperial resources would be divided. The galaxy's underworld might actually prefer the status quo of competing Sith Masters to having a single unified ruler who could focus on stamping out crime. The Force-sensitive children being born across the galaxy during this period would be fought over more intensely than in the original timeline. Both Plagueis and Palpatine would want to find and recruit them before the other does. The Inquisitors would be split or competing with each other. Some Force-sensitive children might fall through the cracks entirely, growing up without training from either Jedi or Sith. Others might receive incomplete or conflicting training from Imperial agents serving different masters. This could create a generation of Force users who don't fit into traditional categories of light or dark. The unknown regions and other unexplored parts of the galaxy would become important. Both Plagueis and Palpatine might send expeditions into the unknown regions looking for ancient Sith or Jedi knowledge, powerful Force artifacts. or simply places to hide resources and followers from the other. This would accelerate galactic exploration, but also spread the conflict beyond known space. Unknown civilizations might encounter the Empire for the first time and immediately be caught in the power struggle between two Sith Lords they don't understand. The world between worlds, that mystical realm outside of time that appears in Star Wars Rebels, could become a battleground. If Plagueis learns of its existence through his research into the nature of life and time, he might try to access it. The ability to move through time would be the ultimate advantage in his conflict with Palpatine. He could go back and prevent his own near death, or forward to see the outcome of their struggle. Palpatine would do everything possible to either access it first or deny it to Plagueis. The Force itself might seal off this realm entirely if Sith Lords try to abuse it, recognizing that time manipulation by dark-side users would corrupt reality itself. The question of what Plagueis truly wants becomes important. In the original timeline, we only know him through Palpatine's story, which is obviously biased. With Plagueis alive and active, his true goals would be revealed. Does he want to rule the galaxy, or is political power just a means to continue his research? If he could achieve immortality and unlimited resources for his experiments, would he even care who sits on the Imperial throne? He might propose a deal to Palpatine. You handle the Empire and the politics, I continue my research without interference, and we both get what we want. Whether such a deal could ever be trusted by either party is another question entirely. Palpatine's fear would be a constant factor. In the original timeline, he's afraid of nothing and no one by the time of the original trilogy. He's overconfident to the point of arrogance. But with Plagueis alive, Palpatine would know real fear. He'd be constantly paranoid about assassination attempts, about Plagueis turning his servants against him, about his master's experiments creating something that could destroy him. This fear might make him more dangerous, driving him to increasingly extreme measures. Or it might make him more careful and calculating, aware that one mistake could be fatal. The technology of the Empire would advance faster with Plagueis involved. His scientific mind, combined with unlimited resources, would lead to breakthroughs in cloning, cybernetics, and genetic engineering. The Empire might develop enhanced stormtroopers with superior reflexes and strength, or clone commandos that are individually as skilled as Jedi. Plagueis might even succeed in cloning Force-sensitive beings, creating artificial Jedi or Sith that can be mass-produced. This would fundamentally change warfare in the galaxy and pose new ethical and practical questions about the nature of life and the Force. The cloning facilities on Kamino would be of special interest to Plagueis. He might take control of them for his own experiments, or at least ensure he has access to their technology and expertise. The clone troopers that fought in the Clone Wars were just the beginning of what cloning could achieve. With decades more research and the willingness to experiment without ethical constraints, Plagueis could create beings designed for specific purposes: assassins with enhanced Force sensitivity, diplomats with hypnotic voices, or soldiers who feel no pain or fear. Each of these creations would be another tool in his arsenal. Padmé's death takes on new significance if Plagueis is working on immortality. In the original timeline, she dies of a broken heart, or more accurately, of Palpatine draining her life to sustain Anakin. If Plagueis is alive and has successfully prevented his own death, could he have saved Padmé? This question would haunt Anakin. If he knew that Plagueis could potentially have saved his wife but chose not to, or if one Sith Lord saved her but the other let her die, it would fuel his rage and possibly drive him toward one master over the other. Padmé alive and held by one of the Sith Lords as leverage would be the cruelest manipulation imaginable. The role of the Force Ghosts would be interesting. In the original timeline, Qui-Gon discovers how to retain consciousness after death, and he teaches this to Yoda and Obi-Wan. These Force Ghosts guide Luke and provide hope that death is not the end. But if Plagueis has also found a way to survive death, though through dark side means, it creates a parallel between light and dark approaches to immortality. The light side achieves it through selflessness and letting go, becoming one with the Force while maintaining identity. The dark side achieves it through control and domination, forcing the body and midi-chlorians to obey. Both work, but they represent Fundamentally different philosophies. Obi-Wan's role as a hermit on Tatooine watching over Luke would be more complex. With two Sith Lords, he'd need to hide Luke not from one set of Imperial searchers, but from two potentially competing sets. If Plagueis and Palpatine each want Luke for different reasons, Obi-Wan might be able to use their conflict to keep Luke hidden. Or he might find himself facing double the danger as both Sith Lords deploy resources to find Vader's son. His job becomes exponentially harder, and he'd need to be even more careful about using the Force or revealing his presence. Yoda's exile on Dagobah would similarly be affected. In the original timeline, he's hiding from Palpatine and waiting for Luke to be ready for training. With Plagueis also in play, Yoda might have additional information or concerns. He was alive during the time when both Plagueis and Palpatine were working together, though he didn't know their true identities. If he learns that both survived the Jedi Purge, his assessment of the situation and his training of Luke might emphasize different things. He might teach Luke specifically how to exploit conflicts between dark-side users, a skill that would be crucial in facing two Sith Masters. The final confrontation in Return of the Jedi would be completely different. In the original, Luke faces Palpatine and tries to redeem Vader, succeeding at the cost of Vader's life. With Plagueis alive, that throne room could contain 3 Sith instead of 2, or Plagueis might be elsewhere, forcing Luke to deal with the fact that defeating Palpatine doesn't end the Sith threat. Luke's realization that violence isn't the answer, and his refusal to kill his father, would be tested even more severely. How does pacifism work when there are 2 Sith Lords and both need to be stopped? One possible ending is that Luke's compassion and refusal to give in to hate actually saves the day in an unexpected way. If his example somehow reaches both Plagueis and Palpatine, showing them a path they never considered, it could break the cycle. This seems unlikely given how deeply both are committed to the dark side, but Star Wars has always been about hope and redemption. Perhaps seeing Vader redeemed by his son's love would force both Sith Lords to confront what they've become and what they've lost in their pursuit of power. It's a slim chance, but it's a chance. More likely, the ending would be darker. Luke might have to accept that some people can't be redeemed and that sometimes violence is necessary to protect others. This would make him a different kind of Jedi than those who came before, one who understands both light and dark, and makes hard choices based on wisdom, rather than rigid adherence to rules. He might become the first of a new kind of Jedi Order, one that learns from the failures of both, the old Jedi and the Sith. This order would understand that balance means accepting the existence of darkness, while not being consumed by it. The galaxy after the Sith conflict resolves would be fundamentally changed. Decades of being ruled by competing Sith Lords would leave deep scars. Trust in government would be destroyed. The Force would be viewed with fear and suspicion by many. Entire generations would have grown up knowing nothing but war and oppression. Rebuilding would take centuries, not years. The new republic that emerges would need to address not just the political and economic damage, but the psychological and spiritual damage of living under Sith rule. The question of whether Force users should be allowed to hold political power would be debated intensely. Many would argue that the Sith's ability to manipulate minds and wield supernatural power made them impossible to oppose through normal democratic means. They might call for laws restricting Force users from government positions or requiring them to register and be monitored. Luke and Leia would have to navigate these calls carefully, understanding the fear behind them while also recognizing that fear-based policies often lead to injustice. Plagueis' research and discoveries would pose ethical questions for whoever inherits his work. If he succeeded in understanding midi-chlorian manipulation and life creation, should that knowledge be preserved or destroyed? The scientific value is enormous, potentially allowing for cures to diseases, extended lifespans, and better understanding of the Force. But the potential for abuse is equally enormous. Who decides what to do with knowledge that could save billions or enslave them? This would be one of the most important decisions the post-Empire galaxy would have to make. The survivors of the Imperial era would have complicated feelings about the time of two Sith Lords. Some might remember it as the worst period of oppression, when the dark side was at its strongest. Others might remember the stability and prosperity, at least in certain sectors. Still, others might recall how the conflict between Plagueis and Palpatine actually created opportunities for resistance that wouldn't have existed under a unified regime. History would struggle to judge this period fairly, especially since much of what happened at the highest levels would remain secret. The Jedi texts and holocrons that survived would be studied intensely for any information about dealing with Sith who can't be killed. The ancient Jedi faced similar problems with Sith who used dark side alchemy to extend their lives or resurrect themselves. Those old techniques for sealing, binding, or containing unkillable dark side users might become relevant again. Luke might need to become an expert in Force techniques that the modern Jedi Order had forgotten, reaching back to the Old Republic for knowledge on how to deal with threats like Plagueis. The Force itself would have been strained by decades of two powerful Sith Lords, both using it for their own purposes. Some planets might become dark side nexuses from proximity to their conflicts. Other places might become unusually strong in the light side as a counterbalance. The Force would be out of balance in ways that would take generations to heal. Force-sensitive children born during this time might be unusually powerful or unusually troubled, marked by the turbulence in the Force itself. The mythology and stories that emerge from this era would shape galactic culture for millennia. Tales of the two Dark Lords would be told alongside the stories of Luke Skywalker and the Rebellion. Future Force users would study this period to understand what happens when the dark side grows too strong and what it takes to overcome it. The lessons learned would influence everything from political philosophy to religious thought to military strategy. This would be remembered as the time when the galaxy came closest to eternal darkness and somehow survived. If either Plagueis or Palpatine achieved true immortality, the implications extend far beyond the original trilogy timeline. An immortal Sith Lord would be an eternal threat, impossible to permanently defeat. The galaxy might enter a cycle of constant vigilance, with each generation producing new heroes to fight against the same ancient enemy. Or the immortal Sith might eventually grow tired of conflict, having experienced everything power can offer and finding it hollow. This would be the ultimate test of the Sith philosophy. Does power really bring satisfaction, or does it just create an endless hunger that can never be filled? The relationship between master and apprentice in Sith tradition would be examined and possibly reformed if both Plagueis and Palpatine survive long-term. They might conclude that the rule of two creates unnecessary conflict and weakens the Sith, or they might double down on it, arguing that their struggle makes each of them stronger. Their choice would define what the Sith become going forward. A Sith order that abandons the rule of two might become more stable but also more vulnerable to the same infighting that destroyed the ancient Sith Empire. A Sith order that maintains it might remain strong but would always be limited to two members locked in eternal conflict. The very concept of what it means to be Sith would evolve. Plagueis represents the intellectual, scientific approach to the dark side. Palpatine represents the political, manipulative approach. Their coexistence forces a question. Is there one right way to be Sith? Or can the dark side be channeled in multiple valid ways? This philosophical question would matter to any dark side users who come after them, shaping how future Sith or dark side organizations develop their practices and beliefs. In the end, the scenario of Plagueis surviving changes Star Wars in fundamental ways. It's not just about having two villains instead of one. It's about exploring what happens when the dark side is represented by two different philosophies and approaches. It's about examining the limits of power and ambition when you can't trust your closest ally. It's about testing whether Luke's compassion and the light side's principles can overcome not just evil, but eternal evil. It's about asking whether the cycle of conflict between light and dark can ever truly end, or if balance means accepting that the struggle will continue forever with different champions. The galaxy would be darker, more complex, and more dangerous with Plagueis alive. But it would also force characters to grow in ways they wouldn't otherwise. Luke would need to become wiser and more strategic. Leia would need to become a more skilled political operator. Vader would need to become more independent and capable of choosing his own path. The rebellion would need to become more sophisticated in exploiting enemy divisions. Everyone would need to evolve to meet the challenge of 2 Sith Lords instead of 1. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from this scenario. Challenges force growth. Easy victories teach nothing. The heroes of Star Wars are defined by the obstacles they overcome. Giving them a harder challenge, an enemy that's twice as dangerous and infinitely more complicated, would forge them into even greater heroes. They'd make mistakes, suffer losses, and face moral dilemmas with no good answers. But they'd also discover reserves of strength, wisdom, and compassion they didn't know they possessed. That's what makes this what-if scenario so compelling. It's not about making things grimdark or hopeless. It's about raising the stakes high enough that overcoming them means something profound. The story of Plagueis surviving isn't just an alternate timeline. It's a meditation on power, loyalty, ambition, and what it means to truly win when victory seems impossible. It asks whether 2 evils fighting each other is better or worse than one unified evil. It explores whether knowledge and science can be evil in themselves, or if evil lies only in how they're used. It questions whether immortality is a blessing or a curse, whether eternal life means eternal purpose or eternal emptiness. These are questions without easy answers, and that's exactly why they're worth exploring. So what if Darth Plagueis survived Palpatine's betrayal? The galaxy would burn brighter and darker simultaneously. Heroes would rise higher and villains would sink deeper. The Force would be strained to its limits and potentially beyond. And in the end, the question wouldn't be whether good triumphs over evil, because that's too simple. The question would be whether wisdom can overcome power, whether compassion can heal what hatred has broken, and whether hope can endure when darkness seems eternal. Those are the real tests, the ones that define not just Star Wars but every story about the struggle between light and dark. And in this scenario, those tests would be harder than ever before.